Dr. Ben Olguin's career is in some ways the mirror opposite of Dr. Crawford's. While Dr. Crawford went from the ivory tower to a motorcycle repair shop, Dr. Olguín went from the barrios and boxing rings of Houston, Texas, into academia. You see, contrary to family tradition, Dr. Olguín discovered that he isn't a boxer, he's a teacher and a poet. Through poetry, he helps young people who are struggling to find their way in the world, deal with the vagaries of life while they try to live in a society that continues to be fraught with prejudice and inequality. I am proud to say that he is a friend, un amigo, and he is a teacher, un maestro. Please welcome with me Dr. Ben Olguín.
Thanks. Thank you again. Appreciate it. I'd like to begin today by honoring everyone at the Cohen Center with a poem. This poem engages many of the inquiries that inform the great classics and great works that have inspired the Cohens to inspire others, especially teachers. The poem I will read, however, was not written by a classical Greek or English Renaissance poet. Rather, it was written by a 16-year-old Mexican-American male incarcerated in a juvenile detention center. It is entitled On Lock, and I'll read it in its entirety. Every day is misery in a certain stage, not knowing how to be a citizen. So I wonder how it feels to be free. Is it like what they say in the movies? Glory, power, and fame? Because all I feel is pain in this so-called correctional place trying to keep us maintained. They treat us like beasts, can't even keep us unleashed. So I wonder, how would they treat us in general population? Would they beat us till we fall to our knees? Or would they bow to their knees and say, please forgive me? This familiar prisoner's lament is written in free verse with shades of hip-hop rhythms and barrio ebonics. It is a vernacular soliloquy that presents a simple yet serious meditation on citizenship. Written in a workshop I conducted for incarcerated youth, the poem is in dialogue with other prisoners of all eras, of course. But it is also in dialogue with us, particularly the presumptions we may have about our own freedom, the nature and quality of our own citizenship, and our very ontology, that is, our theory of being. This is to say that in addition to glossing Socrates, there's a little bit of Hamlet in there too. And I make these comparisons even though I recognize that the poem's opening lament of, quote, not knowing how to be a citizen seems clumsy, perhaps even naive. But upon closer reading, we see nothing less than the same meditations that animated Plato's classic, The Republic, which Diane referenced earlier. This book, as was noted, focuses on many things, but one of the things it focuses on as well is the vexed relationship between justice, society, and art, particularly poetry. Ironically, The Republic includes discussions about the perceived dangers of poets. Poetry, it is argued by some of the characters, poetry enables different insights that might inspire people to militate for change. Therefore, poets should be banned from the city. It's actually a proposal that one of the characters makes. This is where the poet Christopher F. becomes important to our discussions this weekend. I should note that I never knew Christopher's surname because he was prohibited from self-disclosure by laws created ostensibly to protect minors, but which also further effaced him from the polis. For the time mandated by his sentence, he was banned from what prisoners call the free world. Yet I believe his poetry reveals some of the reasons we need poets, particularly marginalized youth who find themselves at the other end of the law for one reason or another. Let me explain. Christopher's poem traffics in multiple tropes, that is, symbols that continually get embedded with more complexity. His operative trope is citizen, which has always been a circumscribed, variable, and very unstable category. Freedom also is placed under scrutiny, and by the end of the poem, its meaning is inverted. The term general population also is important. The poem references the practice of allowing prisoners to mix with other prisoners in contrast to those placed under administrative segregation, such as solitary confinement. I want to suggest that this trope becomes an allegory of a deeper schism, our separation from the capacity to empathize. As the poet laments being prevented from mixing with other human beings in prison and out, he calls into question whether or not any of us in the free world truly are connected to each other. The poet also alludes to the old adage that power corrupts by signaling how he is at the mercy of guards and staff who do not feel the need to question their own role in the prison apparatus, just following orders. This frightening allusion further synthesizes the earlier troping of humanity by reminding us of our capacity as a society to accept and sanitize cruelty that is experienced by young people as bestial. They treat us like beasts, can't even keep us unleashed. Christopher simultaneously laments and indicts. The crescendo of the poem occurs in the last three lines. The prison poet steps into the role of another famous convict, Socrates. This juvenile dramatic dialogue becomes a classic Socratic dialogue in which the wise old sage, in this case a 16-year-old Chicano convict from very impoverished south side of San Antonio, draws us into a space where true learning can occur by refusing to provide an answer to any question. I mentioned Socrates as being infamous for frustrating his pupils because he was more interested in framing more questions than coming up with an answer. Christopher similarly constructs his poem as a series of questions and impressions designed to get us to ask more questions. We are asked what freedom feels like. We are asked to consider what is human. We are asked to meditate on the binary of us and them. More importantly, this poem asks us to consider who is to blame for a society that fails its children, then incarcerates, chains, forcibly medicates, and physically restrains them at a rate higher than any country in the history of the world. I'm speaking of the United States of America. The axis of the Socratic dialogue occurs when the relationship between citizenship and deviance is turned on its head. As we know, Socrates himself was imprisoned and executed, or forced to commit suicide, for raising similar questions about right and wrong, justice and injustice, and the true nature of societies that mistakenly are referred to as democracies. I want to submit that this prisoner, this contemporary prisoner, Christopher, is teaching us something just as important as Socrates, Jesus, George Jackson, Angela Davis, Malcolm X, Marilyn Buck, Raul Salinas, Luis Rodriguez, and legions of other prisoners. He is jarring us into interrogating ourselves as a species and the true nature of the society we have built. Taking to heart a lesson bequeathed to us by the ancient Greeks, that is, that we can find universal truths in very local contexts if we just pay attention to the details. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other lessons that we, as educators and citizens of the world, might glean from incarcerated youth in 2 juvenile centers where I've worked in San Antonio, Texas. One of the immediate issues that comes to mind when I speak of prisoner education, of course, is crime. The great majority of prisoners, respond, in U.S. prisons are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, petty property and drug use offenses. Yes, there are also quite atrocious acts committed by people, some of whom ultimately are incarcerated. But my job as an educator is separate from police, judges, and jailers. True to the spirit of liberal education that Donald Cohen explores in Unbinding Prometheus, I am committed to helping students, wherever they may be, achieve their potential, whatever it may be. Another question I frequently get is, why poetry? Given the complex social problems present among prisoner populations, it might seem more productive to facilitate a group or therapy discussion session. But I maintain that poetry can facilitate a different type of self-help that is just as important. I've always gravitated towards the Renaissance idea that literature's raison d'etre is to both teach and delight. In his retort to Plato's suggestion that poets should be banned from society, the English Renaissance poet Sir Philip Sidney insists, quote, "The significance of the nobility of poetry is the power to move readers to virtuous action," end quote. This action also includes contemplation. Indeed, the intellectual, visceral, and spiritual can be accessed or at least glimpsed via the literary arts. After all, it was Plato who reminded us in the Symposium that the ideal, as in the ideal form of beauty, which he calls the pure forms, are horizons that are always beyond our reach. But he points to, or at least implies, that it is this continual inquiry and search that ennobles us as a species. This paradigm of perpetual self-help through inquiry has obvious social value, as people of goodwill will contemplate and try to actualize a society that can bring out our fullest potential. This paradigm of perpetual self-help is ideal for prisoner education too. It does, of course, require substantial reframing through Freirean pedagogies that respond to the unique vernacular literacies and experiential knowledge that predominate among prisoners. And a chapter in my book deals with all the different pedagogical paradigms that work and don't work for one reason or another. And I'm happy to share that and discuss that further if you'd like, to give you a palpable sense of the actual programs, the actual pedagogies that we've used with varying levels of success. So, but I can't talk about that in detail today, but what I can talk about is something that all good teachers already know. Our success in the classroom can be improved by our understanding of student experiences and realities outside of class. Poems from incarcerated youth can help us begin to comprehend and empathize with students, particularly the disruptive ones, the defiant and angry ones, the students who get diagnosed and frequently incarcerated for oppositional defiant disorder. It's also known as being a teenager. I was one of these guys. I'm a perpetual rebel. At least I try to be. These students write of extreme and widespread poverty, insurmountable odds stacked against them, and violence everywhere they turn. Even their expressions of resilience betray the enduring toll of it all. For example, in one poem entitled "Alone" by the poet George P., age 16, shares a bit of his home environment. He writes, and I read the poem in its entirety. "Alone I stand, isolated and cold, not ready to move without wind of direction. There seems to be some misconception. The air is stiff as it sticks to my skin, no warmth to the isolation. Warmth is what's sought, shelter it's what's fought, to stand and be ready with guidance of steps. The pain is still heavy. Alone led me to a pace so steady, from the deserted road to the abandoned home. No window, no drapes to cover up and hide the wind that whispered in the abandoned place. Being alone is all I can take." The poem's minimalist didactic style and impressionistic flourishes are deliberate. Prior to being incarcerated, George's home was an abandoned building with no window panes or running water. He wanted his reader to, quote, "feel the cold," he said to me, and how being alone and lonely was both his curse and his conditioned comfort zone. For a period of his life, he had apparently had no parents or guardians. His only mentors were people he referred to by the prison term of endearment, crime partner. It is an honorific to be called the crime partner. Some of my colleagues are my crime partners at school. But this is to say that this poet is underscoring the archetypal schism of which Christopher wrote in the poem I read earlier. He is at odds with the polis and all its citizens. In a different poem, Christopher F. offers a related reflection on the barrio as a violent Athenaeum-like space. except that here the lessons learned are Darwinian survival stratagems that eventually harm us all. His poem, Who I Am, glosses the form of a Greek tragedy in which the action is governed by fate as well as terrible errors in judgment and character flaws. It reads, I'm just another kid grown in the streets, praying for the Lord to forgive me for all the tragedies. But as I sit here trying to sound off this beat, I'm out of speech, thinking about the homies that are 6 feet deep. They once called me a thief, locking their doors while I'm walking in a creep. Because I'm hearing voices and can't even think. They're telling me to go slice a throat and watch his family weep. Call me an alcoholic, call me murderholic. But on the inside, I'm just a boy, crying and looking for another way to maintain instead of hurting people and creeping up on them in the deep of the night while everybody's eating tacos and going to sleep. I want to underscore the poem's ending. The poet is just a kid and embodies all of us to some degree, but especially our societal failure to protect this kid. And this failure is a threat to everyone, not just because the autobiographical poetic persona may kill one of us, a very real possibility, let me tell you, but because he is part of the human family chain that is only as strong as its weakest link. Unless we deign to judge this person, we need to recognize the limited mentoring opportunities and educational infrastructure available to meet the unique pedagogical and other needs of barrio youth. Another poet, Drake C., age 15, who is from an even more economically depressed barrio in San Antonio, reveals that he could be an ideal student. Yet his circumstances are such that he is most proud of something else. In an undated anti-lyric prose poem, he writes, a thief, youth, resident, jailmate, whatever you want to call me, but I won't be like my father, an alcoholic. Whatever you call me, I'll absorb it like a sponge. I'm a person who likes to hold my tongue because I know you'll learn more when you shut up and listen. I'm a person who'll break into your house and take everything, even what's in your kitchen. I'm someone who will have you jumping, but most of all, at least, I'm someone who holds my own. In Drake's mind, his chief virtue is not his capacity and predisposition to learn, absorbing it like a sponge, whatever lesson is at hand. Rather, he is resigned to privilege his proficiency as someone who holds my own, which in this vernacular context usually means the ability and willingness to victimize as a strategy to keep from being victimized. As you might guess, many of these incarcerated youth poets recount the lack of critical mass of role models, intensely difficult economic situations, and complex peer pressures. But it may also surprise some of you to know that they also acknowledge their own responsibilities and activities that got them incarcerated. Moreover, their path from home and sometimes homelessness to prison affords them a street-level view of our own frail humanity. They are especially insightful about our reluctance to embark on the difficult, self-critical inquiry that they have undertaken. The short one-stanza poem titled The World I Live In by Andres S. reads as follows. The world spins and swirls, the outside beautiful but inside makes me want to hurl people living on the street or on the curb, hit and runs and no attempt to swerve. God, heal me with his herbs. It is significant to note that in the barrio vernacular, a drive-by refers to the act of a shooting or shooting at a rival from a passing car. But here the drive-by is troped not as barrio internecine warfare, but as a hit and run with us as the driver. That is, our, your, and my inclination to drive by these tragic contexts with, quote, no attempt to swerve. I'm particularly struck by the barrio vernacular rendering of the science of the rotating earth. It becomes a metaphysical meditation that inevitably unravels into a radical skepticism and existential lament that reminds one of Charles Baudelaire's bleak vision of modern urbanity and fleurs du mal, flowers of evil, and even Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, existentialist anthem. We are part of the same twirling earth whose, quote, outside is beautiful. Some of us have had the privilege and opportunities to find joy in it. The poet, on the other hand, is nauseated by it, and he is disgusted with us, particularly with our inhumanity and the false civility that comes from material comforts he has never known and likely never will. We drive by his barrio and some other barrios, Oak Cliff, other barrios like the one I'm from, oblivious and willfully ignorant. And yes, I do understand that in the audience there are barrio educators, committed, lifelong barrio educators. I know that. But George is reminding us of the enduring schisms and class divisions that render our successes as radically incomplete. As I share this poetry from incarcerated youth, I am not naive about its impact or reach. It is an understatement to say that this poetry is unpleasant. The Renaissance idea that art can delight and teach is overpowered by their intense dystopian visions. Trust me, it gets worse. Poetry from prison reminds us that we must include ethics in our paradigm of a liberal education anchored by the arts. After all, the Nazis were art lovers. Art did not prevent the Holocaust. And Theodor Adorno goes so far as to say, quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is obscene," underscoring the radical limits of art. Yet at the same time, I submit that the obscene and barbaric aspects of our society make art, especially art from prison, so necessary to help free us from our own barbarity and our ignorance about our barbarity. After all, these incarcerated youth also offer reflections that are familiar to people outside the barrio, ghetto, and prison. In the Cindy Cryer Residential Treatment Center, which is governed by the neo-eugenicist idea that deviance is biologically based, the great majority of students are diagnosed with one illness or another. And again, the most common one is oppositional defiant disorder. I can't even believe they invented something like that. These youth subsequently are coerced into a regimen of psychotropic drugs. They have no choice in the matter. Their related writings underscore the destructive positivist belief that we can find a quick fix to complex problems. In this juvenile detention center, so many prisoners are under mandated drug regimens that I remember one student troping rebellion and deviance by refusing to take drugs that prison staff were trying to force him to take. He actually told me, "I ain't crazy, I just got busted stealing." And it's just, I don't know what happened to him, but I fear that they were going to force him to take these things. As a scholar of the history and politics of prison and prisoner cultures in the U.S., I cannot remain silent about how this use of drugs to control youth deviance intersects with the dubious history of the political uses of drugs in prison to control deviance, defiance, and rebellion. In the 1960s and 1970s, Black, Latino, Native American, and white revolutionary political prisoners were forcibly medicated as part of government torture and domestic counterinsurgency campaigns. This legacy continues in Guantanamo Bay and in the broader torture regimens used by the U.S. in the War on Terror. It should not need to be stated that these practices, which are not aberrations, but consistent practices that distinguish and debase the U.S. society, are antithetical to the idea of a liberal education. I realize that my discussion of incarcerated youth has now ventured into the realm of foreign policy. The interrelationship, however, between prison and U.S. foreign policy is long-standing, and it's evident in the recent exponential expansion of immigrant jails, some of which house entire families, including children who are citizens. That's going on to this very day. Global and national citizenship is troped in many poems, writings, and drawings by incarcerated youth from my collaborative workshop at the Baptist Children's and Family Services Immigrant Youth Shelter, a facility that has received millions, hundreds of millions of federal dollars. These students speak of predatory gangs, people falling to their deaths from the train they call La Bestia, or the Beast, drinking green water after treks through the desert, starvation, seeing bodies, being raped. Their countries of origin also reflect political developments, such as the 2009 US-backed coup in Honduras. This interventionist foreign policy has resulted in Honduran youth overtaking the number of Salvadoran and Guatemalan immigrants in some Department of Homeland Security detention centers. As a Chicano of indigenous heritage, I am most struck by another demographic feature of immigrant youth prisoners. Some are from Indian villages in Guatemala so remote that they do not even speak Spanish, not a word of Spanish, much less English. One of our anthologies had to be written in a multilingual format of English, Spanish, Spanglish, then Chicano Ebonics, Mam, and 2 dialects of Quiché. I recall one reflection by a Guatemalan student who wrote about walking the same path that his father walked, that his father's father walked, that his father's father walked, which turned out to be part of a folkloric tale he was taught in his village. It is a village he knew that he likely would never see again. There was nothing left after a series of cataclysms, from the 1980s genocidal U.S.-backed war against indigenous insurgents to the incessant Christian missionary efforts to convert the Indians. I know that many of these missionaries have good intentions and they believe they are doing well. But their missionary activities exploit politically created desperation and are nothing less than cultural imperialism. And they are fundamentally racist in believing that these Indians, that we need your God, or a different God. These 16th century colonialist practices also continued in these federally funded shelters, which require all of these incarcerated youth to sit for Christian prayers prior to every meal, regardless of their faith. At least half of them are not Christians. There are many more lessons to be gleaned from incarcerated youth, but one thing that I learned from 3 decades of prisoner education projects is that writing, as well as teaching and learning, are political acts. So is our definition of deviance. Some scholars, like black feminist theorist Bell Hooks, propose the paradigm of teaching to transgress. She writes that it is only by teaching the legitimacy of rebellion that we have been able to challenge oppressive practices and paradigms such as racism and segregation. Now, I do understand, as a teacher, I do understand that this privileging of transgression sounds like an invitation to create more headaches for teachers. We have enough already by the administrators, right? But she is speaking about nothing less than the Platonic idea that we earn and actualize our humanity by questioning everything every day. I want to close with reflections on other rebel teachers, particularly the 43 docents who were massacred in Ayotzinapa, Mexico last year. I'm sure you've heard of them. There was a film last night at UT Arlington. These students were from the same teacher education school as another teacher named Lucio Cabañas. He was a peasant who, in the 1970s, dedicated himself to teaching the poor in rural Mexico, where everyone was so poor that even the teachers went to work barefoot. His teaching, and more importantly, his learning from students, led him to become part of more kinetic forms of education and social transformation projects. That is to say, he became a guerrilla, an insurgent, in an organization called the Party of the Poor. He eventually was murdered by the Mexican government, but is immortalized by his acts and his model and his following statement. It goes, "Desgraciados los pueblos donde la juventud no haga temblar al mundo y los estudiantes se mantengan sumisos ante el tirano." It roughly translates as, "Woe to the people whose youth do not make the world tremble and whose students remain submissive to tyranny." I suspect that this power to reimagine and to remake the world, which in fact is the Greek etymology of poetry, is what worried Plato, whose characters, as I mentioned, saw poets as potential outlaws. But I believe that this dialectic of the teacher as student, the student as rebel, and the rebel as teacher is what ultimately will ensure that we eventually find our way to our humanity collectively. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am honored to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Dan Russ was my high school teacher, and is now a mentor and my friend. He has been involved with the Dallas Institute since its founding, but he has known the Cowans from his graduate days at the University of Dallas, where Dr. Donald was a mentor and Dr. Louise was his teacher. Along with having been mentored by Dr. Donald Cowan, Dr. Russ's broad experience across all levels of education, both as a teacher and as an administrator, gives him a unique understanding of our topic today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Russ as our final plenary speaker.
Thank you. Gay Marie's introduction reminded me of one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I was finishing my dissertation. Louise Cowan was my dissertation director, and she said, "Can you meet me at the university this weekend?" And I said, "Of course." And when I got there, she and her husband were there. They had me at one end of a table, writing and working, and then I would hand them sheets and they would both go over it together. It was an awful experience. Children lack imagination. The first time I heard Louise Cowan say this, I confess that it left me bewildered. I thought back to my own childhood when I am told, tied a bath towel around my neck in the midst of a thunderstorm and flew down the alley behind our house like Superman. Then I realized, no, not like Superman, I was Superman. Or what about the time I became my father, who owned a small construction company, when I took all the leftover paint cans and commenced to paint our garage a rainbow of colors? I was found out when I went to the corner grocery store to have a candy and Coke break and told the grocer to put it on our tab. He complied and then made a phone call to my mother, who promptly brought me back to reality as she marched her little paint-covered man home. And I see the same lack of imagination in my grandson Theo when he drives his tiny matchbook car all over my furniture, sometimes chasing a T-Rex. He is not pretending to drive that car. In his mind, he is driving that car, and you best get out of his way. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that children have within them the latent ability or capacity to become someone or something other than their little selves. An innate ability which can be cultivated and educated into a mature imagination that does not confuse and conflate reality and fantasy as young children are prone to do. What is the meaning of imagination, and why is it central to educating the young? Imagination is so basic to human nature that it is impossible to express it in an efficient and irreducible definition, like a mathematical formula. For at the heart of imagination is the capacity to intuit and understand, to recognize and celebrate paradox, ambiguity, unexpected, and even violent connections, as Ben's poetry reading just evidenced to us, as well as the constancy, that is to deal with the constancy of change and mutation in space and time that is to be human. I suspect it is what computer scientists were trying to discover when they realized that computers programmed by traditional logic could not imitate the flexibility and constant adjustment that the simplest human mind makes constantly. They finally came up, as some of you may remember, with the term fuzzy thinking. In fact, I think, Bill, you used that term last night, which they define as, quote, to explore the paradigm shift from black and white to gray, from bivalence and binary either-or thinking to multivalence, a less simplistic but more accurate way of thinking that responds to life in matters of degree, integrating probability and ambiguity in all modes of operation, end of quote. Perhaps fuzzy thinking was a poor choice in words because its use and association with confused thinking experienced by people whose illnesses affect their ability to think clearly, they admit later was a bad choice, but they were working in some ways without imagination of their own. I think these scientists were trying to imitate the human imagination that cannot be expressed by a traditional linear quantitative logic. Perhaps Donald Cowan's description of the function of imagination clarifies what fuzzy thinkers were searching for. Quote, "One might say that knowing is always particular, a knowing of one thing. Understanding is more general. It places the particular in a class, the class of things that are similarly understood. Knowing is outward directed, understanding is inward directed," he says. Imagination is the faculty that mediates this process. It takes a full-bodied, copious image of the object, puts it in order, and presents it to the understanding. The imagination presents new material to the understanding in a copiousness of joy. Of course, he had to include that. By the way, one of the connections that struck me last night in our discussion of joy is that in New Testament Greek, the root of joy is also the root of grace, rooted in the same word. What Cowan suggests is that imagination can move from the particular to the general without losing the particularity, the reality of the definite, which the analytical intellect tends to do in its abstract ideals and ideas. The imagination does so by use of analogic that, in William Lynch's words, quote, "insists on keeping the same and the different, the idea and the detail, tightly interlocked in one imaginative act," end of quote. This analogical thinking is as rigorous and rational as other forms of logic. Greek philosophical logic, historical chronologic, the logic of scientific naturalism, quantitative data analysis, sociologic, psychologic, and so forth. I often have to correct my students, as a matter of fact, who say, "I love literature because it's not about reason, it's about how the poet feels and how I feel about what he feels." Now, feelings are certainly one of the definite and particular realities included in the analogical imagination, but they are given their place according to the measure, which reminds me, by the way, Diana, in your comments with Plato, analogon literally means according to the measure, giving things their proper measure. So we give our desires their proper place, but we don't let them take over. The artist deals with other realities as well: plot, character, theme, place, historical context. And Cowan, like many others who emphasize the importance of the imagination, says it is as crucial to science as poetry, to engineering as it is to painting. Likewise, James A.K. Smith describes the imagination as, quote, "a kind of faculty by which we navigate and make sense of our world, but in ways and on a register that flies below the radar of our conscious reflection, and specifically in ways that are fundamentally aesthetic in nature." He goes on to say that this is the reason that a provincial farm boy is willing to die for his country in a far-off land, which we regard as a tragical act of beauty. In other words, imagination enables us to grasp and understand the possibilities of truth, goodness, and beauty in the very stuff of matter and in the very nature of human beings, in our sufferings as well as our joys. So how does a school educate such an imagination in our youngest citizens in a system that is obsessed with facts and data, standardized testing, and I think, as Matt was suggesting earlier, standardized minds? Let me hasten to say that our current version of this obsession is not new. We see it, for example, in Headmaster Gradgrind in Charles Dickens' Hard Times. An educational bureaucrat, as you may recall, visits Gradgrind's school, and he poses this question to his students. Suppose you were going to carpet a room. Would you use a carpet having a representation of flowers upon it? The character Sissy Jupe replies that she would because, quote, "if you please, sir, I am very fond of flowers." He responds, "And is that why you would put tables and chairs upon them and have people walking over them with heavy boots?" She responds, "It wouldn't hurt them, sir. They wouldn't crush and wither, if you please. They would be pictures of what was very pretty and pleasant, and I would fancy." "Aye, but you mustn't fancy," cried the gentleman, quite elated by coming so happily to his point. "That's it. You are never to fancy." "You are not, Cecilia Jupe," Thomas Gradgrind solemnly repeated, "to do anything of that kind." "Fact, fact, fact," said the gentleman, and "fact, fact, fact," repeated Thomas Gradgrind. Dickens apparently saw this movement among educationists in the 1850s in his native England when he created one of his most infamous characters. And Gradgrind's demand for fact, fact, fact resonates today with the regional accrediting agencies' demand for literally data first and quantifiable outcomes. As Cowan warns, quote, "rote learning avoids imagination and takes its material directly to memory, tagging it there by something like a mnemonic device for ready recall," end of quote. Or, to put it differently, we can retain a lot of facts and data in our heads, at least until the next test, and still understand almost nothing. So back to my earlier question. How does the school educate the imagination of students so that the particulars they learn about the world leads them to a richer and truer understanding of the world? Such an education begins with the study of imaginative literature, what the Greeks called poetry, as Ben just suggested. There are many ways, and poetry literally meaning poesis, again, making, to make. There are many ways we learn truth because truth is complicated, thick, and often messy. Among the youngest mentees, we call these ways subjects, and later we may call them disciplines. What in elementary school we once called math, we eventually divide into algebra, geometry, calculus, statistics, and so forth. Reading becomes English, grammar, spelling, writing, short stories, novels, poems, and plays that are later divided into comedies and tragedies. We teach our students to think mathematically, chronologically, scientifically, musically, and analogically, and later sociologically, psychologically. In fact, earlier, Diana would suggest philosophically. As they are led through this journey, their courses of learning must match their abilities to study, learn, and love the complexities of the world and the life they live. But no matter how high and deep and broad their knowledge and wisdom become, story is the most basic way they continue to learn. And I think it's because we are born, and we live, and we die. We don't become very conscious of all that until in the midst of things, we become aware at a certain age that we are mortals for all that is worth. This is why the math teacher who leads his students from the mystery of numbers to the order of the cosmos will tell of his first encounters with calculus, which often involves a story or two about a demanding and now beloved professor. This is why a musician often tells the story of what motivated the composition of the work we are about to hear, or the historian tells the story of how an artifact or document was discovered that changed our understanding of this epic or that ancient culture or this misunderstood king. In other words, while we teach truths from growingly disparate disciplines, teaching as mentoring always involves good storytelling, as was done this morning in looking at Melville and talking about the historical context. So a story takes us into a certain history, into current events, and then back to other stories. Now, please understand that I am not privileging literature as the most important discipline, although it might be, or suggesting that all teachers are merely storytellers. But I do think that no matter what subject or discipline they teach, teachers tend to recount historical, literary, and personal stories because they remind both us teachers and our students of the wonder, mystery, and beauty of reality seen from the many vantage points represented in the various academic disciplines. Before most of us entered into a discipline of study and teaching, we saw in a text, heard in a musical performance, found in a mathematical principle or lab experiment, an access to and a glimpse of the glories of creation. In fact, one of the ways I talk to college students about what major they ought to finally decide on, basically use the analogy of when you go to the optometrist and he starts dropping these lenses. And he says, is this better or this or this? In many respects, the genius of a liberal arts education, at the college level especially, is that you get exposure to so many disciplines and you suddenly realize which ones open the world to you. And by the way, the other great thing about that optometrist is you go to that person so that that person can tell you what you ought to do in terms of glasses or contact lenses. In fact, what he's actually doing is asking you to tell him. It's an interesting juxtaposition of the subjective and the objective. This is what philosopher Jacques Maritain called the radiance of the form, which he explains by, quote, by radiance of the form must be understood an ontological splendor which is in one way or another revealed to our mind, not a conceptual clarity, end of quote. Conceptual clarity is important, but clarity, like telescopes and microscopes, make us blind to some realities so that we can focus on others. Part of the problem, I think, with the science that several people have addressed last night and today is that it forgets that the scientific method is also a way of blinding itself. It forgets its own blindness. In telling the stories about the teacher or the writer or the scientist that opened to us the mysteries of creation with their ontological splendor, we remember for ourselves and witness to our students that the subjects we teach, the disciplines we master, are always larger, more mysterious, and yes, more beautiful than our analytical minds can grasp. Imagine around a table, and Adler was presenting the Paideia proposal, which he and Donald Cowan and about a dozen other distinguished educators had worked on, which was essentially a liberal arts education for all students in all public schools. The best education for the best was the mantra. The best education for the best is the best education for all. So if you're going to give it to the elite, give it to everybody. This is a democracy. So he explained that, and one of the leaders of the city broke in and said, this sounds elitist to me. And so Adler said, he tried to explain, no, it's not elitist, and he explained a little bit of what I've just said. And then the man came back and said, okay, so we do this. Who mows my lawn and repairs my roof? Yes, I know. And Adler said, I'll give you two responses to that. First, you're presuming a person who is well educated would not want to work with his hands. Matt, to your point. He said that's simply not true. Many people will choose, after getting a very fine education, to work with their hands. He says, secondly, if they don't want to repair your roof, they'll create a machine that will do it for them because they're smart enough to do that. They've been well educated. The problem with the classical model was not only a disdain for common people, as well as women and slaves, but it was a disdain for physical labor, for putting our hands to things. I suggest that we reject that aspect of the classical model of liberal learning and recover the classical Hebrew and Christian traditions of the rabbis and the monks. They loved learning as passionately as did any Greek. Tell me a little Torah was and is a refrain of these teachers of the Jewish tradition who constantly read, meditate on, and discuss and argue the Mosaic law, and they did so and do so with passion and joy. But they were also bivocational. They put their hands to work as carpenters like Jesus and tent makers like Paul. They did not believe in this split between the work of intellect and the work of the hands, between thinkers and workers. Donald Cowan goes so far as to write that by this practice of separating young minds into workers and thinkers, democracy is thereby rendered a virtual impossibility. In the liberal arts tradition of Jews and Christians, all human beings are body, mind, and spirit, and to be free is to be free to be human, we must honor and engage the whole person. Likewise, some of the great intellectuals of all times were Christian monks who not only studied and prayed and worshiped, but cooked and gardened and cleaned and made bread and ale. I am not calling for a return to homemaking and shop classes, although now I've met Matt, we'll discuss that later. But I am suggesting that we find ways for our young students to put their hands as well as their minds to work as imaginative makers of their very material, gloriously embodied world. Or to put it differently, what practical disciplines and tasks of living together in schools can be opportunities for our students to serve and make a difference in the world with their hands? Can we imagine as educators, lovers of our young people, a quality of education that moves beyond the binary model of thinkers and workers? How can we marry minding our culture to body forth the truths we teach and learn, putting our hands with imagination to what we have learned with our minds? This wholeness of mind and body is perhaps what Moses had in mind in Psalm 90 when he asked God to, quote, teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom, end of quote. And then he closed the psalm, confirm the work of our hands. Yes, confirm the work of our hands, end of quote. Such a vision for wisdom and the work of our hands for liberal learning in our democracy frees our students to embrace life with imagination, mind and body, spirit and strength. Our teachers and students deserve no less than such a holistic, liberal education grounded in imagination, literature, and language, so that together we may learn to love the world and the wisdom that is our heritage and the future we are called to co-create. Thank you.
I am not sorry that we went a little longer in the talks and have a little bit less time for discussion at this point, because we'll have our panel afterward, but we do just have a few minutes, and I wanted to ask, first of all, if you all had any comment to make about any particular point. I have comments, of course, but if you wanted to make a remark about something that...
Well, I want to thank Dr. Russ for bringing things full circle. The abstract, the appreciation of beauty through the ethical to the corporeal, because I think we have to have a holistic approach. This is tending to also different physical abilities, right? I'm not the 106-pound boxer I used to be, right? I have a lot of limits. I can't run anymore. We need so when I privilege or when I reference the corporeal, it is just to, not to privilege certain physicalities, but to put these all in play in the learning experience and in the search for humanity. And this is why I referenced last night the theater of the oppressed, because you'd be surprised how much you can learn and teach through performance. Agusto Boal's theater of the oppressed paradigms are just profoundly liberating, and it's through the body that we're able actually, to meditate on these complex abstract thoughts. Sometimes it's just through reading, but what I like is that you brought these all together on par. So thank you.
Well, what I was struck by in Ben's presentation was how you liberated those students in leading them to write poetry. The fact is, we know plenty of students that are good, compliant young people, never will get in trouble, who do not do that level of reflection about themselves or about their world. So that sense of freedom of mind and soul and heart that in the terrible circumstances in which they exist is quite amazing, but it's a real witness to the power of liberal education.
Absolutely, yeah. I think so.
And it reminds me of the Greek phrase that we get from Aeschylus, the pate mathos, the suffering into wisdom, which both of you were talking about, the making, the story, the language being the means by which one not only makes something in the world, a story, but also makes oneself. So the dissociation that we have by pulling the mind and body away from one another really is resolved in this. Can you talk just a little bit more, either or both of you, about that? Dan, you said something that resonated with hearing those pained, beautiful poems, Ben, that you read when you remarked, Dan, that truth is messy, and that what is it about the making, the suffering into this kind of wisdom, into truth, that we need to work on or move into, or what are the barriers, what are the obstacles here that are keeping us from dealing with the messiness of truth? We want truth, as Don said. We've forgotten science as a metaphor too. We've forgotten that ways of knowing are metaphors. So how do we move beyond this messiness?
Well, embrace the messiness, first of all. And this is a lesson that comes to us from Chicana feminists and black feminist writers. They have developed, in different ways, a genre they've adapted St. Augustine's Confessions in a new genre called a genre called testimonial literature that was really synthesized into a different thing around the 1980s or so. After Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa and Cherry Moraga, these feminists used all the horrors and the defeats and the violences that they endured individually and collectively in life. They took these as the subject of their writing, and they developed this genre that's structured, it has three parts. It's praxis, theory, praxis. So they took their bad experiences, they wrote about them in a text like Augustine, using that writing as a time to meditate. And the genre differs from autobiography, because usually autobiography ends by these people reintegrated into society as upstanding members of society. But the testimonial writing from black and Latina feminists reminds us that the battle is not over. The material causes of all these harms are still there, and we're using this text not so that you can put me on a pedestal, but so that I can teach you about all our mistakes, so that maybe you can take this book and take it to another level and go back into the battle. The praxis, theory, praxis, teleology, or structure. And so in response to this, they are embracing the messiness and the difficulty and the nonstop defeats by recognizing that they may not have all the answers, but they are theorizing the situation. They're all searching for different truths, and it goes a lot of different ideological directions. But key is to embrace these defeats and difficulties and synthesize them.
And this is what the boys are doing. The boys use poetry.
Yes, we bring in Latina feminist testimonies. Now, it is with the young men in young women's prisons, and are also taught in these places as well. There are other dimensions that are profoundly difficult to deal with, and that are, as I'm a paramedic, beyond my scope of practice. We do not, so sometimes these practices can be dangerous. When you introduce the life writing genres, things come out that you're not equipped to deal with, or that there isn't an infrastructure to deal with. You cannot cause more harm. You cannot operate beyond your scope of practice. And that's something that's extremely dangerous. So it's easier with males for a male to go in, and it's just really difficult. That's a whole different discussion I have in one of my books. Yeah.
Speaking of messiness, huh?
Absolutely.
I would say that what was addressed this morning, Elizabeth, with the Iliad and with war, what it seems to me Homer does in the Iliad and the Odyssey is to take all the confusion and the messiness of war and all the poor motivations and the bad leaders and so forth, but he does give it form. It's not as opposed to messiness. It's something that includes that. And we see that in the Odyssey, because the war is over and won, and now Odysseus has to return to the mess that is created, the unintended consequences of that. And I think you see that in Henry V, in which we are told in the actual play that the very things that Henry has won, his son will lose in the next generation. We know at the beginning of Beowulf that the mead hall Beowulf saves will burn down in the next generation. So there is that sense in which every generation is going to have to face these things. I mean, so it's not of the great writers, it's not clean, it's not neat and easy, and they do show the suffering. But they also show that even in the midst of the worst circumstances, there is courage and glory, true glory, that happens despite mixed motivations and political manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop us there, and we'll take a break until about 2:15, and we'll come back here and we'll be set up for the panel. Do remember, if you have a question for the panel at this time, to leave a card out at the desk with Aaron, and we'll collect those and bring those up to discuss. So thank you.
Thank you very much.